1251st day of the war. Another portion of the blow to the back was delivered from brother Serbia. The Minister of Europe said that it is ready to impose sanctions against Russia if there is a counter-movement from the EU. This outraged Russian propagandists. They were very angry. Vučić even tried to put an end to everything with the words that the minister was misunderstood, but it did not help much. The struggle of Putin with the expansion of NATO continues. Another country, this time Austria, thought about the refusal of neutrality and the entry into the North Atlantic Alliance. This was told by the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, emphasizing that Russia is a serious threat. Call that due to the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine, Finland and Sweden have already joined NATO. Putin is also successfully fighting for security. For the first time in recent years, the Navy parade was cancelled on the Day of the Navy. The reason is security. After 3.5 years of a successful and victorious war, Russia does not dare to launch ships even in the rear. In St. Petersburg, however, a record number of Ukrainian UAV attacks was carried out. In the Z channels, there was an ongoing hysteria about the fact that Russian troops retreated to the Sumy region, and part of the Russian military got surrounded and were destroyed. If there were rumors about this before, then now this has become a public and has been confirmed by large seamen. Well, as always, they whine about false reports and other things that are always hand in hand with the Russian army. The situation with the capture of Pokrovsk by Russian forces is getting worse. Now, a record number of Russian armed forces groups is concentrated in the direction. If Ukrainian armed forces won't be able to break the situation in the near future, then the capture of Pokrovsk in the coming months may be just a matter of time. But Igor Strelkov is just seeing a threat for the Russian army. He is sure that the new offensive of Ukraine in the near future is inevitable and is misjudged by the successes of the Russian armed forces. He believes that there is no serious advance and the authorities are doing nothing instead of fighting. We will talk about this in a different way in today's Fresh Report, which you can support with your like, your comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your subscriptions are especially important. For YouTube algorithms, this is the most important indicator, so if you watch without a subscription, click on this button from such 60%. So this button does not compel you to anything, but it will help to promote a specific video. You can support the channel financially on Patreon. The link to it is in the description, and by buying NVPN. This is a means to bypass blockages that allow you to bypass blockages. Watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, Instagram, go to blocked resources. For example, Anastasia Kashavarova writes that on August 1 she will also block WhatsApp in Russia. I don't know if it will be blocked or not, but sooner or later it will block everything. It seems to me that this is already quite obvious, so VPN is a necessity. If you want not only to get a high-quality product, but also to support some channel, for example, mine, then buy NVPN by the link in the description. Well, we are moving on to what happened in the past day. Serbia can impose sanctions against Russia if the perspective of the country's entry into the European Union becomes obvious. This was stated by the Minister of Europe, Nemanja Storovic, in an interview with the Austrian agency APA. According to Storovic, Belgrade has not yet joined the anti-Russian sanctions of the European Union, since such measures have practically no effect on Russia and will cause serious damage to the Serbian economy. An example, he brought the situation during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Croatia received from the EU Reconstruction Fund 22 billion euros, while Serbia received only 165. The minister, on the other hand, emphasized that Belgrade from the very beginning of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine clearly and unambiguously condemned the actions of Moscow. He also commented on the accusation that Serbia allegedly makes insufficient support for Ukraine. When we are reproached for this, the answer is simply, let's let the Ukrainians speak for themselves, for the Vylons in particular, for the help that Belgrade gives to Kiev. After these statements caused a stormy reaction in Russia, Vučić went to fix the situation, saying the following: "We will not introduce sanctions against Russia. Our policy is based on the principles and national interests," said Vučić in an interview with the Dania Courier. He called the statements of Storovic careless, which caused a sharp reaction of the Russian pro-government media, which saw a revolution in the politics of Belgrade in the direction of Brussels. Are these words of Vučić and the Russian Federation calm? Of course not. While many understand that Serbia, as part of the ongoing war, is doing what is beneficial to it, including supplying weapons to Ukraine through bypass schemes, for which she is very grateful. Therefore, of course, Vučić's position looks like an attempt to extinguish a fire, and for some it looks like an attempt to extinguish a fire with gasoline. But the basic understanding is that all the countries that somehow interact with Russia do it not within the framework of firm beliefs, but in search of benefits. Moreover, we are talking about small and not very influential players, but about the largest ones, such as China and India. Putin knows that he has little time, that is why he is waging a war with such a cruel intensity. This opinion was expressed by the head of the Austrian Foreign Ministry in the interview, Die Wild. Ida Mainl-Reisinger emphasized that Ukraine wants peace, and Russia does not, but the most important thing from this conversation is that she said that the country is thinking about refusing neutrality and joining NATO. Major-Reisinger stated that in the background of an uncertain situation in the field of global security, and all the more aggressive Russia, Austria is ready to discuss its refusal to neutrality and the possibility of joining NATO. Although at the moment neither in the parliament nor nor among the population, there is no majority in favor of the membership in NATO. Such a discussion can be very fruitful. We cannot sit down and say, if we do not harm anyone, no one will harm us. It would be naive. The world has changed, she said. She also added that if Putin were really interested in the world, he would start negotiations on the ceasefire right now. But he continues to lead the war to destruction, says the diplomat, evaluating the war in Ukraine. This leaves no doubt that the thinking of Austria about joining NATO is directly connected with Russia's actions, which means that this country can already be the third to join the alliance because of Putin's actions, who stated that his entire activity is aimed at expanding the North Atlantic Alliance. Earlier, after the full-scale invasion, as you remember, Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Have the threats increased for Russia? In the representation of those who believe that NATO is preparing to attack Russia, you can look at the map and the borders. Putin, as a result, is the best NATO marketing agent in history. Because of him, the number of countries involved is growing, as well as the cost of the states entering the alliance for defense. Maynard Reisinger also noted the catastrophic losses that Russia is carrying. At some point in Russia, the coffins will begin to accumulate, she said. Let's get to this catastrophic economic situation. It is becoming more and more difficult for the Kremlin to continue this war, and Putin knows that he has little time, the head of the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs emphasized. Which is quite harmonious with the video that I recently released about slapping the mole. Look at it, listen to it. I said there and continue to claim. First of all, Putin's position is not the same as it seems to Putin himself and his fans, like Latin. Also, this position is becoming mainstream. Well, that is, American media, Western media, European media continue to wake up and understand what is happening in reality, not in the fantasies of Kremlin sources. Putin congratulated sailors in St. Petersburg on the Day of the Navy. Earlier, the main naval parade in the city was cancelled, and not only there. Vladimir Putin arrived at the main admiralty in St. Petersburg to check the operations of the Navy. July storm, writes the Telegram channel Kremlin Novosti. Naval maneuvers took place from July 23 to July 27 in the waters of the North and Black Sea, the Pacific Ocean, the Baltic, and the Caspian. Earlier, the press secretary of Putin, Dmitry Peskov, reported that the main naval parade in St. Petersburg, which takes place every year on the Day of the Navy, was cancelled due to security reasons. This is a great illustration of the fact that the situation for Russia is getting worse. All previous years, including the years of war, Russia could still hold these parades, but now it cannot do this. This is simply dangerous, and Russia has created conditions in which what used to be acceptable is now unacceptable for Russia itself. That is, it has limited itself. It has done everything possible to increase attack on it, to increase efficiency, so that Russia does not dare, well, you know how. It's funny there, Kotz, in my opinion, in the year 22 or 23 wrote. Yes, we are still holding a parade because no one will scare us, and it is very important to hold a parade during the war. Now Kotz wrote, yes, it is right not to hold a parade during the war. Security is more important than in there. Well, that is, the flyers, of course, follow the course of the party, but the change of the course of the party, the change of the real situation is on the ground, as the Russian authorities like to say, on the face. At the same time, the Leningrad region was really attacked on the day of the WMF, and the largest since the beginning of the war. In the morning of Sunday, the Leningrad region was attacked by more than 10 Ukrainian UAVs, said the governor of the region Alexander Drozdenko. Until then, the region had not encountered such an intensity of air attacks. Ukrainian UAVs attacked the Leningrad region on the Navy Day, when a military naval parade, cancelled due to safety considerations, was supposed to take place earlier. Drozdenko reported the danger of UAV attacks at 6:35 a.m. at 7:28 a.m. at the service of the Russian Air Force. He informed about the restrictions on the reception and departure of aircraft at the Pulkovo airport. At 10 o'clock, according to Drozdenko, more than a dozen drones were destroyed in the area. Disruptions of UAVs, as the governor wrote, fell in the Lomonosovsky district to the Gachina in its vicinity. In the Lomonosovsky district, a fire occurred due to the fall of the drone. Later, Drozdenko wrote that the number of disembarked UAVs had increased. According to the governor, the breakdown of drones fell under Kingisepp and on the territory of the industrial zone in Primorsk. In these cases, there was no fire, said the head of the region. More than 100 flights were detained due to restrictions on the arrival and departure to Pulkovo, said the channel Shot. What really was hit in St. Petersburg, and was it hit? We will find out in the near future, according to information from the Sintra and satellite images. At night, according to the Ministry of Defense, 99 Ukrainian drones were shot down over the internationally recognized territories of Russia, the Black Sea, and the annexed Crimea. Most of the drones were shot down by the Air Force over the Bryansk region, according to the data of the Russian military department, which we do not trust in absolute numbers, because they always lie and say that they have shot down everything, and then we see rotting factories, but accordingly this gives some kind of idea of the scale. At the same time, the attack of UAVs in the Leningrad region in the report of the Ministry of Defense, believe it or not, was not mentioned. Today, the largest attack of of UAVs in the Leningrad region was called an air raid on the night of January 4, when 4 drones were shot down in the region. However, this record could be exceeded on July 6, when, according to the data of the Ministry of Defense, 3 UAVs were shot down overnight over Len region and 2 more during the day. In any case, as long as UAVs fly, as long as there is a war with sanctions, geopolitical strategies, support for weapons, or imposing additional restrictions, as well as kinetic sanctions by drone strikes, the most important thing is happening on the ground. Where Ukrainian defenders continue to defend their country, continue to defend their citizens, continue to save women, old people, and children, by which Russia beats every day. And Ukrainian military risk their lives and give them these lives in the fight against the fascist occupation army of Russia. Therefore, we continue to help them. This is the most normal and adequate action that any person on the planet can do right here and now. This is to help victims of aggression defend themselves. Therefore, the meeting for the 26th ABR continues right here today. Yesterday, we donated very well. Thank you all for taking part. Well, the fundraising is big, so we still continue to close it with you. And I remind you a message from the fighters of the Artillery Brigade of Intelligence. You are greeted by the soldiers of the 26th Artillery Brigade. For the support of our volunteers, we announce a large fundraising for the Interceptor. There are enemy reconnaissance drones hanging over our guns 24/7, and at this moment the gun cannot work and the personnel risks their lives. So we appeal to each of you to protect the sky above the guns so that we can continue to work together until victory. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Here is the QR code for Monobank. Somewhere here appeared, most likely in the description. Link to Monobank. On private, there is already a maximum number of transactions exceeded. In short, yes, therefore Monobank, PayPal, and cryptocurrencies are the best for the bank. Everything is available in the description. Cryptosheiks are always glad to join, so to speak, to the movement. And thanks to everyone who has already taken part in this meeting and who will take part today and who will take part in future meetings. Unfortunately, I have an endless number of them because the war is going on and support is needed now, in general, as never before. As you can see, and as we will talk today, there is a gap between the Russian offensive and the Ukrainian defenders. It is very difficult, but they are incredibly strong, incredibly brave, incredibly self-reliant. They hold back the Russian troops and manage to cause them quite serious losses and hit the Russian personnel, equipment, and everything else that the Russian fascist occupation army has. Well, we are moving on. Igor Strelkov, with the thoughts of which we now get acquainted with you once a month, recently wrote an anxiety post for the military audience, in which he predicted an immediate and large-scale attack of Ukrainian armed forces. According to him, it is inevitable. This is what the former shooter of the entire war at the very beginning wrote sitting in prison. The situation is developing according to the scenario, writes Gherkin, as Merlin would say, from the Strugatsky's book Pondelnik begins on Saturday. Have you noticed, sir, what the weather is like? Predictions. It's a pity that we can't rejoice at the outcome of our predictions as these comedians' fantastic characters. However, our King Arthur, as always, is cheerfully, fun, and immeasurably genius. Apparently, it's about Putin. It seems that only a year after Trump's inauguration, he began to guess that he was fooled again. But this is not for sure. Not that he wasn't fooled, this is for sure. But started to guess, and I can't guarantee the latter. Thus, in half a year, we have a couple or triple in our asset, maybe a little more than a square kilometer of forest landings and fields, plus 2 or 3 dozen, and as much as 5 dozen. I did not count the villages destroyed before the foundation of the rural settlements, plus 1 or 2 or even 3 villages of the city. In the passive, for another half a year of slowing down the necessary measures for the victory in the prolonged bloody war, as well as another half a year of the absence of real-life decisions on the failed all the VIP officials. Half a year of the image of action instead of action in the various areas of the economy and the social sphere, in the science of education and culture. Sports I take for granted. Here we have so many achievements. We now have Ovechkin as a national hero. He is the absolute NHL champion. He is worshipped by half of America. In general, to put it simply, he writes, for half a year we gave the former dear Western partners so that they could better prepare for the war with us themselves. Since they helped the so-called Ukraine more than before, of course, the berries are still far away. But the flowers in the form of UAV barely over all regions of Russia and the Amur region, including in no way to hide from the grateful population. But the berries will definitely be in time, be sure, perhaps soon. Our offensive once again could not knock out the enemy in the territory of the DRP, take at least one city, not counting my own free will, to destroy, all the more to surround and destroy at least one military part of Ukrainian armed forces. The enemy actively defended himself and continues to actively, sometimes even successfully, counterattack, carefully taking the backup. Soon we will have to find out in this way where and how Ukrainian armed forces will present us with another surprise. The offensive of the enemy, or at least his attempt, I believe, almost completely inevitable. If the enemy's attack ends with failure, that is, with success for us, our troops, then our command of the country will receive another head start on time for taking over the mind. However, there is so little hope for this that there is almost none. Putting a nose in the gentle hands of the partners, this is always welcome, but to think or to show the will and courage is not to us, writes Jerkin. In general, the opinion that Ukraine is preparing a certain offensive and that it will be in the foreseeable future is quite seriously distributed among the Z channels. Periodically this is written by Podolyaka, periodically ghosts of some kind of movement of Ukrainian troops there, pulling up reserves there or there, and other Z channels see. But from the side of Ukraine, from the side of Western knowledge, from the side of objective control, I still do not see anything that would hint at this. On the other hand, the offensive in the Kursk region, which, in my opinion, was very successful, led to the exchange of a large number of Ukrainian soldiers who were in captivity. Because a large number of soldiers were captured, tore Russian plans for the offensive in the Sumy region. The Sumy region, burned Russian equipment to nothing, and generally seriously then out the Russian troops in general. I value the Kursk operation as successful. Until the appearance of the North Korean troops. After that, when foreign meat appeared there, and the main culmination of the Russian action was the cutting of the logistical routes of Ukraine, which led to big problems and the exit of Ukraine from the Kursk region. In general, the operation, it seems to me, was quite successful and indicative. And especially indicative was that in what secret she was preparing, yes, that is, no one knew what it would be, no one saw its preparations, well, that is. They said that Russian scouts saw some kind of movement, but did not give it meaning, so, in principle, the situation in which we can see some kind of Ukrainian offensive in the Bryansk region, again in the Kursk region, again in the Belgorod region. Maybe a counteroffensive in Pokrovsk, that is, with the cutoff of Russian peonies of which we have a large number on the Pokrovsk direction, or rather the Pokrovsk direction, yes. In the Donetsk region in general, we will see, as you can see, Igor Strelkov from his previous forecasts, in which he says that such an offensive is likely, switch to the forecast that such an offensive is practically inevitable. While many again write everywhere and in the West too about the Great War and the possibility of a Great War here and there from day to day and so on, and it must be said that a very interesting post was written by Sladkov, where he wrote that Russia is not ready for such a thing. Ivan Filipov, who collects Z-Folklore, tells about this interesting post, which was removed post by Sladkov, who is military affiliated. Yesterday he wrote it first, and then, for some reason, he deleted a detailed, well-argumented text on why and in what. Question: the Russian armed forces are in deep minus. This is a quote. Maybe he read it and realized that the final text does not fit with his beginning and middle. The question is asked by Ivan Filipov. What kind of text is this? Let's get acquainted with it. So look, writes Sladkov. Managed to work in the Pentagon at the American military bases in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Bosnia and the USA themselves, Dallas, Honolulu and Germany. I lived and worked in the largest center of U.S. military training in Fort Jackson at the Academy of Sergeants, Chaplains, Recruiters. I worked in West Point. It's not because I'm so great, it's just that I was lucky. I was lucky to track down the entire chain of American military recruitment from the smallest station on Broadway to the release of newcomers from the textbook. I can argue that our armed forces in the matters of mob readiness, creation, account, and preparation of the reserve are in the deepest beep, to a great regret. The military commissariat and digitalization are at a distance of 10 light years from each other. If I am accused of a lie, I can suggest where to go, look, and shoot at the same time. I understand that there is a reason for everything I will not discuss here. In fact, the contracts are in view of the content of the documents and responsibility of its execution by our soldiers, by our state. It is generally harmful to discuss here. Especially if you compare our two sheets of contracts in the war and the world in the U.S. Army. We Russians always have our own path. If we want to become invincible, we need to count this path, draw it, explore it. Even if the sky falls on the National Defense Center in Moscow, they are imitated like mice on an amber. Today this, we want tomorrow that. Judging by our today's costs, there was money in the country for the war, and it was necessary to spend them on time and correctly. Fighting is more expensive than preparing for war, especially if you fight and at the same time catch up with the enemy in terms of supply, create weapons so that it is no worse than the enemy. We are really the most combat-capable army in the world. I can't imagine what heights we have reached to ensure the safety of Russia if we had done everything at least on DMAR. Writes Sladkov, and indeed agree, the ending of the text does not fit with its beginning, middle, and, in general, all the texts in principle. But there are problems with Ukraine, and many of them are related to the very law that deprived NABU and SAP of independence, which will now be abolished in the near future. I hope that this will happen quickly because it has a direct influence on the support of Ukraine from the West. European Union has suspended 1.5 billion from the general aid packet in Ukraine, reports the New York Times. The decision is related to the law signed by the President of Ukraine, Vladimir Ramzilian Law, which deprives the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, and the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, SAP, of independence, giving it to the General Prosecutor's Office. As the General Fund Help to Ukraine was established in the 24th year, it provides a budget of $50 billion for 3 years to restore the country and prepare for the entry into the European Union. Funds from this fund cannot be used for military purposes and will depend on the implementation of Kiev's criteria in the field of state management and the rule of law. The representative of the Euro Commission, Guillaume Mercier, reported that Ukraine applied for new payments in June, despite the failure of 3 of the 16 key indicators. Among them is the inability to appoint judges to the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court. The New York Times considers the pause as a sign that the EU is ready to show more criticism of Kiev's domestic policy, despite the ongoing war. The publication also emphasizes that this can indicate a decrease in trust in President Zelensky from Western partners. At the same time, the publication says that pause is not the final one. Funding can be restored if Ukraine fulfills the conditions set. I think that the main reason is just this law that was adopted. I think that it will now be cancelled. In fact, it has already been announced, or rather, they are leading a new one that cancels its position, and everything will return to its own circles. Again, really unfortunately, this whole story with NABU and SAB looks like an anecdote about what we are with you, John, for eating beef for free. Well, that is, what was the idea until the end is not clear. What was the meaning at the moment is also not clear. And in the end, only negative consequences negatively reacted to the Ukrainian society, negatively reacted to Western partners, negatively reacted specifically to the Americans too. And the most ardent supporters of Ukraine, like the Senator Lindsey Graham in general, yes, indeed, this is probably a big mistake, but it is very good that it is corrected. Everyone is mistaken, plus or minus. It is important how you react to the mistake, and if really, as it was announced in the near future, all this will be eliminated, well, that is, this whole attempt to deprive these departments of independence. And if they still work normally on something, it will be wonderful at all. Then we will hope that everything will return to its own circles. 20 people were injured of a different degree of gravity as a result of a drone attack in the Sumskaya region. The local prosecutor's office reports about this. She clarified the data about the injured. Initially reported that 5 people died, according to the department, 3 pensioners. They were 66, 74, 78 years old. In fact, what happened is that Russia hit a bus, which is just a civilian bus that drove in the Sumskaya region, and hit a drone. That is, this is a target strike. Most likely this Russia does, including from the dissatisfaction that in the Sumskaya region, the Russian offensive failed completely, which is now recognized by the Z channels and in general everyone. In fact, the Z channels report large losses and retreats of Russian armed forces from Kondratovka, the Sumy region. We are with you. As you remember, we have already discussed this. Well, because in the media and officially everything appears already strongly after we discuss it with you, because we are doing analysis of the objective control data of information that comes from the place. So here we are in the summaries. The information appears much earlier because, well, as it were, we are not doing some kind of reprinting there. We are not waiting for the media to finish it themselves and reprint something or until the reporters recognize everything. We are working a little ahead of SCHEDULEU. But as you remember, a week ago, the task called the Ukrainian fake information about the major losses among the Russian troops during the storm Kondratovka. Kondratovka in the Sumy direction of the loss on the Ukrainians is already storming Alexivka. The situation in the Sumy region is extremely difficult due to the lack of reserves, and so Gerasimov, head of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov, always, writes Alex Parker returns. Another, more respected from this channel in this environment, the Belarusian powerhouse reports about the loss of almost all the personal personnel of the 34th Shooting Regiment of Russian Armed Forces. Today, my friends have confirmed that in Kondratovka in the Sumy direction there are forever left fighters of the 30th MSB, who until the last held their position. Unfortunately, it was not possible to break through to them. The enemy just non-stop watered them with moose, knocking out our artillery. All this is accompanied by continuous cruisers from FPV. That is, it turns out that just in spite of the fact that constantly Russian media from this channel write about the fact that Russia will do this boiler here, boiler there, in fact, does the Ukrainian army, and indeed in Kondratovka, Russian troops of the 30th MSB trapped in the boiler and were completely destroyed. The Telegram channel of the Paratroopers Diary also confirms large losses of the 30th from the firing regiment and writes the following. I keep in touch with the 30th who fought in Kondratovka. It confirms bad news. Another Z channel, two majors expressed doubts that the Russian army ever completely controlled Kondratovka. I have not yet seen the accent, sorry. After all the soon-to-be achieved beautiful reports, they write whether Kondratovka was at all completely ours, at least on the day of the corresponding statement of the respected department. They ask a question. I answer it was not a lie, it was a lie. The liberation of Kondratovka by the armed forces of Ukraine is also confirmed by the Deep State project. The occupation of this settlement by the Russian Defense Ministry reported, believe it or not, on June 4. For the appearance of information, including on Z channels, about large losses in the ranks of Russian armed forces during the assault on the contract, the Russian state media, including the Tats, called it a Ukrainian fake. With a link to the sources of power structures, the agency wrote that it was specifically launched in Ukraine to justify its own local meat assault. Once again, we receive confirmation with you that the Russian Ministry of Defense is constantly lying about its achievements. Well, that is, these are absolutely false reports that have nothing to do with reality, so I recommend to focus on Deep State, I recommend to focus on centers. If you yourself do not want to read anything, you do not want to study anything, look at the reports, because I focus only on centers, and every time I check even the tested centers, so that there are objective control data, we do not believe the word. We look at you, and at the war it is clear there is some kind of flag. It is not a proof that someone has captured something. It is only a proof that someone has leaked somewhere and could be destroyed in a minute. The brightest proof is blows and systematic blows. The opposition party on one or another settlement. If we see a lot of publications of blows to Ukraine on some settlement, this means that this settlement in its own mass is under the control of Russia. And in opposite, it works absolutely the same, so it can be geolocated for this, you can closely monitor. But what you definitely can't do is believe the word of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Or a separate Z agent who especially tells how it means everyone went to Pokrovskaya, how it is now captured, and so on. Deep State in the meantime reports that the Russian army is trying to enter Kupiansk from the northwest. Defense Force is holding an event to kill the assault groups of Russian armed forces, which on the way from Radkovka near a gas station and from Golubovka to the side of the private sector are trying to secure themselves. The situation, writes Deep State, is complicated by the fact that the enemy has a large area of penetration up to Solovka. The enemy's goal is obvious: to stretch the fighting order of the Ukrainian Defense Force, carry out incursions and further blockade of the city from the west side. Here again, it should be said that the Z channel writes that they have already entered Kupiansk and so on. No, they haven't. In general, it seems to me that it is necessary to make a separate video about this. Few people understand what the war looks like now, because many of them, when you ask, well, everyone has an opinion, of course, but when you ask how they imagine it, people imagine the large mass of people who are going like this. It's all wrong. Well, that is, the modern and current war in particular looks completely different. These are small assault groups. These are small mechanized assaults. This is the constant pressure from the drone side. This is Norleys, and so on and so forth. That is, these are not frames of the time of the Second World War where 1,000 people are running somewhere to storm something. There is no such thing on the front line. 2 or 3 people are running. They now have a term in Russia, over small groups, from 1 to 2 people. They are trying to go through the green, through the grass to go somewhere, or to break through on motorcycles, quickly flying in, and they are slowly being eliminated. This is how modern warfare looks like now, so it is important to understand this when we are talking about entering some settlements and so on. Yes, there are 2 people there, the flag was put, they were hit, they died, there is no more fortification. Moreover, the gray zone has now become much wider because of the drones. Well, the kill zone of 5 kilometers is generally a kill, but up to 15 is still a kill zone. Therefore, it is possible to talk about confident control only when the settlement is 15 kilometers from the current line of contact. Then it is the rear, and now there are drones 20, 30, 35, 40 with retranslators and so on, but more or less something resembling the rear begins there at 15 kilometers from a combat line. Therefore, when Russia or Ukraine went somewhere and everyone thinks that this is a confident control where you can calmly walk on the streets, it's not like that, but the drone will fly to you in a second. This also needs to be understood. Well, probably now the main military topic, if we are talking about combat battle, is Pokrovsk. What is happening with Pokrovsk? What happened all last week? What kind of information appeared? What kind of Russian groupings are there? What are the prospects there? What is Russia trying to do? How does Ukraine respond to this? Now we will analyze it as much as possible in order for you to have a complete understanding. Because there are a lot of pieces of information that, it seems to me, for many, including for me, were built into a whole picture. It was provided by Konstantin Mashavets, describing in as much detail as possible what was going on there. The whole week, the situation around Pokrovsk was discussed. Russia has already managed, as they say, to break into the city, so to say, to cancel its own tails. However, in reality, the situation is really very threatening. Konstantin Mashevitz describes the Ukrainian military analytics in detail. Let's take a look at his analysis in detail, starting with the number of Russian troops, ending with potential scenarios which, if Ukrainian armed forces do not break through the situation, are all pretty bad. So the situation in the Pokrovskoye direction is intensified, warns Mashevitz. In this direction, the command of the enemy, that is, Russia, is concentrated and deployed in the Group of Troops Center. Its basis consists of a part and a connection of two general military armies of the Central Military District, most of the forces of the 51st General Military Army, and the composition of the Group of Troops South. In the same direction, the command of Russia is deployed a number of units, which are given to the command of the above-mentioned unification units. The total number of troops deployed in Russia in the Pokrovsky direction is estimated at about 112,000 units. They have about 520 battle units of tanks. Armored vehicles, including various armored vehicles and trucks, have 600-8,700 units. Up to 565 units of armored artillery, including 122 mortars and more than 180 RZVs of all calibers. All these estimates, says Mashevitz, are only conditional and approximate because they do not take into account a significant part of the unprepared armament and military equipment, which is either being repaired or restored. In addition, it is obvious that only a part of this VVT was used in the first echelon by the enemy. According to the combined power and its combat capabilities, the military center group is probably the most powerful among the rest of the Russian troops deployed in the composition of the so-called United Group of Russian Armed Forces in the Southwestern Theater of Military Operations. As for the current situation, the command of Army Group Center, at the moment, is obviously engaged in the implementation of the corresponding plan of offensive operations in its operational zone, the goal of which is to defeat the opposing VSU groups in the Pokrovsko-Myrnograd agglomeration and its full capture. Russia seeks to implement it by flank capture of the Pokrovsko district of the defense of Ukrainian armed forces from the north, northeast, and southwest, with simultaneous front attacks of its front units from the south. Here, Mashevitz recalls what happened before, in order to better understand the current situation. After the capture of the Sladkov district and the exit of its front units on the wide front, Krychevka, Zhurevka, Kazin, Torets, and Bychok, the command of Russian armed forces performed an operational regrouping of its troops in Pokrovsk and Torets directions, as well as a number of organizational changes as part of T Army Group Center. All this together with the substantial replenishment of units and units deployed in their base regions, allowed the Russian command to consolidate the battle order of Army Group Center, to carry out an operational construction of its troops in the Pokrovsk direction, in accordance with the above-mentioned plan of operation. And after a short pause caused by the need to conduct offensive actions on adjacent flanks, Army Group Center Group moved forward with its forces and means to the offensive. The Russian was able to break through in the tactical zone of the defense team on the border of Novotretskaya and Shevchenko, and in the northwest direction. Having reached the border, the successful Kotlina and the northern Vostvezhenka, having broken through to the road to Pokrovsk-Bakhmut, started their offensive both in the direction of Pokrovsk and in the direction of Konstantinovka. It became clear that the command of Russian armed forces at that time tried to achieve two main goals in the direction of Pokrovsk. It was to cross two roads to Pokrovsk-Pavlograd and Pokrovsk-Bizhevaya, while capturing the Pokrovsk district of the defense from the southwest direction, and deeply bypassing the Pokrovsk-Myrnograd agglomeration from the east and northeast, expanding its breakthrough in the north of Vostvezhenka in the west direction. At the moment, Mashevitz writes, Russia was able to achieve the specified goals only partially, spending the entire spring and most of the current summer on it. She managed to block the road to Pokrovsk-Bizhevaya on the area Yuchny-Klina successfully. On the other hand, Russian armed forces are forced to engage in persistent fighting for full control of these settlements for 3 months. Russia managed to achieve more on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsky district of defense, regrouping the main forces of the 51st from the Toretsk side and using the breakthrough of the 8th Army. The Torets-Konstantinovsk direction, Russia managed to break through on both sides of the road to Pokrovsk-Bakhmut in the western direction in a fairly short period of time, 1.5 months of persistent fighting, in the direction of the advanced area of the Nevoeconomic attack, and in the direction of the Dobropolye in the northwest direction, which is outside the Fedorov-Kamaya. At the moment, the situation in this direction looks as follows. The forward units of Russian armed forces broke into the Miryubov, Nevoeconomic, continuing to attack the direction of Myrnograd, and are in persistent fighting in order to secure themselves in these settlements. Other Russian units are persistently breaking into the direction of Dobropolye, which is located on the outskirts of Nikanorov-Kazachok. There is even information that their forward assault groups have broken through to the road of Shakhove-Dobropolye. From the south of Pokrovsk, the assault units of Russian armed forces, apparently, were able to completely occupy the village of Zvervoy, trying to further infiltrate their small infantry group already on the territory of Pokrovsk itself, in order to secure them in the southwestern quarters of the city. On the southern flank in the direction of Alexeyevka, obviously the enemy also had success. The forward units managed to advance from the north of Alexeyevka. The attacks of Russia in the southwestern part of the city, along the border of Vučić and Kotlina, as well as to the south of the Selna River, apparently, were not so successful for it. Ukrainian armed forces continue to hold the border of Muravka and Novoniklivka and to defend itself in Vučić and Kotlina. What to expect in the near future? Asks the question of Mashevez and draws the following scenario. Apparently, the northeastern Pokrovsk, the most threatening area at the moment, Russia will continue its persistent attack on the village of Radinskaya, both from the side of Fedorovka and from the side of Radina, at the same time trying to get as close as possible to the side of Dobropolia. In addition, Russian armed forces obviously will continue attacks in the direction of the new economic Leningrad, as well as Mirolubovka Leningrad. For now, the Russian troops are managing to advance with a rather dangerous pace for Ukrainian armed forces. And therefore, the exit of its front units to Radinskaya is very likely, however, as well as the breakthrough to Mirnograd. If in the near future the pace of advance of the assault units of Russia does not dramatically change, that is, it will not decrease, the fate of Pokrovsk will be decided, writes Małszewicz. Because in this case, the need for massive assaults of the southwestern city by Russian armed forces will simply go away. In this direction, they are so close to the city line, that is, on the convenient sources for assaulting the city on the outskirts and the positions. In other words, the division of Russian army for the beginning of a decisive and final assault of Pokrovsk will be enough to wait until the 51st Army, not counting any losses, crawls to the city from the east and from the northeast. It is very close to that. Moreover, it is quite possible that the 51st Army will not have to crawl up to the city itself at all. It will be enough to simply block it from the north, going to the above-mentioned borders, at the same time taking all communications from the city in the northwestern direction under close control. In this case, the 41st Army, reinforced by the forces of the 2nd Army, will be able to start the main one on Pokrovsk, because its front units are already as close as possible to it. All this can be greatly undermined if the 51st Army also breaks through to Dobropolia, and it has such chances, judging by the pace of promotion of its front units in this direction. In this case, Ukrainian armed forces will receive a problem that is already on an operating scale, and on the Kramatorsk direction, writes Małszewicz. In general, the situation is really difficult and serious. Ukrainian military continue to fight, continue to try to stop the Russian offensive. They has already managed to do this in many parts of the front. In the Sumy direction, for example, the situation not only stabilized in Ukraine and won over several settlement points, surrounding Russian troops and killing them. However, the situation is still quite difficult. Russia to still throw into the offensive everything that can throw and see really possible this offensive as some kind of last, while not achieving anything at all, because there were no significant strategic objects captured. Pokrovsk is also in fact not working, but nevertheless, when and if Russia goes further, then it will threaten other cities. Yes, we will talk separately with you on the days about the Zaporozhye direction and... In fact, the attempts of Russia to break into Stepnogorsk in general, in my opinion, this is how it is called Stepnogorsk. In general, yes. The situation on the front is heavy, Russia continues to advance, so your support for Ukrainian troops is important, as always, or as never, choose any convenient word. I will remind you in the description, in fact, the links to the requisites for the current fundraising. And finally, let's talk a little about the Russian world, what happens after Russia comes to the settlements, kills a bunch of people there, destroys the building, and what in the end turns out there. The DPR government, the self-proclaimed DPR, reported on the arrival of water trucks from Moscow from the Chev regions. In the occupied republic, 75 cars from Moscow arrived, sent on the orders of Vladimir Putin, reports the Ministry of Construction of the Russian People's Republic. According to this department, the cars will work in 2 shifts. Also, more than 60 water trucks should arrive from the Chev regions. As indicated in the report of the head of the DNR, in quotation marks, Denis Sachlin, the total number of emergency brigades has increased by almost double. 50 equipment and people of groups from Moscow have arrived in the region. Also, work is underway to transfer water from the reservoirs, to clean the Rusal River from waste and garbage. Ministry of Nature and professional organizations are cleaning the bottom of the water reservoirs. This should, according to the official report, increase the flow of water into the reservoir. At the same time, the residents of the DPR continue to complain about the quality of drinking water from under the tap, which is supplied once every 3 days. As well as in line to the water tank. There is a real collapse there, and I think we will talk about this in more detail in a separate video, because this is really such a big and important topic when people face the Russian world and what it turns into, someday successful cities such as Donetsk. Well, Michael Nacke was with you and see you soon. All the best. Bye.